The Vorath Empire had raided 712 colonies across 40 star systems. 712. They kept count, the way you might keep count of meals eaten, or steps climbed, or other things that are simply routine. Coordinator Belvash maintained the ledger personally, a thin, gray-scaled officer with 4 calculating eyes and the emotional range of a parking violation, and he updated the numbers after every operation with the quiet satisfaction of a bureaucrat filing paperwork. Efficient, clean, unremarkable. Colony 713 was supposed to be no different. It was a human settlement. Designation, Kepler's Reach. Population, approximately 40,000. Resource yield, moderate. Strategic value, low. Resistance capability, according to pre-raid intelligence gathered by their scout drones, minimal. The humans had some defensive turrets, a small militia garrison, and this is the part that makes the whole story so magnificently, catastrophically ironic, a single outdated communications relay that Belvash's team had already identified and marked for destruction in the first 60 seconds of the operation. 60 seconds. That was how long it was supposed to take to silence Kepler's Reach before it could call for help. Want to know how long it actually took? 41 seconds to destroy the relay. The Vorath were professionals, after all. You don't raid 712 colonies without developing something resembling competence. Their boarding ships descended like metal rain onto the colony's outer agricultural ring. Suppression cannons fired precisely on schedule, and Belvash stood on his command deck, watching the whole thing with the mild interest of someone observing a vending machine dispense a snack they've bought 1,000 times before. And then a human named Petra Voss did something that nobody, not Belvash, not his intelligence officers, not a single strategic model the Vorath ran, had anticipated. She had already sent the message, not through the communications relay, not through any official channel the Vorath had mapped, tracked, catalogued, or even heard of. Petra Voss, 34 years old, agricultural logistics coordinator, absolutely nobody of military significance, had spent 2 years building a tight beam transmitter from salvaged parts inside the colony's grain processing facility. Because she grew up on a world that had been raided once before, survived it once before, and decided very quietly and very privately that once was enough. The signal she sent was 11 seconds long. It contained her colony's coordinates, the Vorath fleet signature, the attack timestamp, and a single standardized distress code that every human military installation within 40 light-years was trained to treat as a priority Omega escalation. Priority Omega. Now, for those unfamiliar with human military classification systems, and honestly the Vorath Intelligence Division remains embarrassingly unfamiliar with human military classification systems, which is a problem we will return to shortly. Priority Omega does not mean please send help when convenient. It does not mean hostile contact, please advise. Priority Omega in the human Terran defense framework means one specific thing: active colony elimination in progress. Respond with maximum authorized force. No confirmation required. No delay authorized. No delay authorized. Belvash's raid was textbook. His troops hit the outer settlements in 3 coordinated waves, suppressing communications, securing resource extraction points, moving inward toward the colony's central hub with the practiced rhythm of an organization that has done this, as established, 712 times before. His soldiers were disciplined. His timeline was holding. Everything was going exactly the way the spreadsheet said it would go. He had no idea that 11 seconds of radio signal had just ended his career, his fleet, and his civilization's comfortable assumption that raiding humans was something you could just do. The first response arrived 4 hours and 17 minutes after Petra Voss hit send. It wasn't a rescue ship. It wasn't a patrol vessel, or a rapid response frigate, or any of the things a sensible military might dispatch to investigate a distress call. It was the TSV Unconditional, a human dreadnought so large that when it dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Kepler system, the gravitational displacement briefly disrupted the orbit of a small asteroid belt 300,000 kilometers away. Rocks that had been drifting peacefully for 4 billion years suddenly lurched sideways like they'd been bumped by a very large, very annoyed cosmic elbow. Captain Dara Okonkwo stood on the bridge and looked at the tactical display, with the expression of someone who has been doing this long enough to feel neither excitement nor hesitation, only purpose. She said 2 words to her weapons officer, a compact, precise woman named Lieutenant Yuki Farhan, who had been at her station since the Priority Omega alert woke every single person aboard this ship from sleep at 0300 hours. Okonkwo said, "Light them up." Farhan said, "Yes, ma'am," and then the unconditional opened fire. Now, here is something the Vorath did not know about human dreadnoughts in general, and about the unconditional specifically, because again, their intelligence division is embarrassingly behind on this subject. Human weapons engineers have a philosophy that the Vorath, with their efficient, calibrated, proportional approach to warfare, find genuinely difficult to process. The philosophy goes roughly like this: if a weapon is worth building, it is worth building larger. If a gun can fire once, it should probably be able to fire 12 times. If a shield can absorb a hit from one direction, it should absorb hits from all directions simultaneously while someone is shooting back. The humans call this philosophy overwhelming force, and they apply it with an almost religious devotion. The Vorath fleet above Kepler's reach had 12 ships. They were Raider-class vessels, quick and effective for their purpose, carrying enough firepower to hold down a lightly defended colony. Against a single opponent, they would have been competitive. Against the unconditional, they lasted 9 minutes. Not 9 minutes of intense, nail-biting combat. 9 minutes total, including the 4 minutes it took Belvash to understand what was happening, issue evacuation orders, watch 3 of his ships try to scatter, and realize with slow, terrible clarity that the dreadnought wasn't chasing them. It didn't need to, it just reached. Its weapons had range that the Vorath raid vessels were not equipped to match, firing solutions so precise that the last Vorath ship to attempt escape was hit twice before it even finished turning around. Belvash survived. His flagship, the Patience of Order, took significant damage but managed to collapse into emergency FTL before the unconditional could finish the job. He brought himself and 64 surviving crew members home to Vorath Prime with his ledger of 713 raids, 1 catastrophic failure, and a sensor recording of the last 9 minutes that would, very shortly, become the most watched piece of footage in Vorath military history. And here is where the story stops being about a raid and starts being about what happens next. Because the humans were not done. Petra Voss's signal had gone to the unconditional. Yes, but Priority Omega alerts do not go to one ship. They go to every human military installation within range, logged automatically in the Terran Defense Command Central Registry, flagged for response, flagged for documentation, and, most critically, flagged for Consequence Protocol review. Consequence Protocol. The Vorath had never heard this term. This was about to stop being their most embarrassing intelligence gap and become something considerably more serious. A man named Admiral Terence Bolad sat in the Terran Defense Command Strategic Operations Center on Meridian Station and reviewed the incident report from Kepler's reach with a cup of cold coffee and the unhurried focus of someone who has learned, over 30 years of service, that the worst decisions get made quickly. His aide, a young officer named Ensign Priya Thak, had laid out the full tactical summary, the fleet engagement record, and the pre-existing database of Vorath raiding activity, compiled over the past 11 years, 713 confirmed raids, 40 star systems, hundreds of thousands of casualties across dozens of colony worlds. And because human intelligence agencies, unlike their Vorath counterparts, are deeply invested in knowing things, they also had the complete economic profile of the Vorath raiding economy, the location of the 9 primary Vorath staging bases used to support colonial operations, and the navigational routes used to move extracted resources back to Vorath core systems. Thak asked, carefully, "Sir, what's our response posture?" Bolade set down his coffee. "We can't keep responding to individual raids," he said. "We've been doing that for 11 years, and they keep coming because there's no cost. There has to be a cost. So, Consequence Protocol. Pull the authorization file. Let's see what we're working with." Thak pulled the file. Consequence Protocol was not a proportional response. It was not a negotiating position or a show of force or a diplomatic statement. It had been written, and this is important, by people who had personally survived Vorath raids, had lost family members to Vorath raids, and had spent years afterward trying to figure out how to make sure it never happened again. It was thorough. It was thorough in the way that only people who have been very genuinely deeply angry for a very long time can be thorough. It authorized the following: the simultaneous military neutralization of all identified Vorath staging facilities, the interdiction of all Vorath supply routes within reach of human fleet assets. And here is the part that made Ensign Thok read the paragraph twice: a full-scale strategic strike against Vorath Prime's orbital defense network, to be held as active threat posture until the Vorath High Directorate agreed to appear before a Terran tribunal and answer, formally, for 713 counts of colony assault, not 712. 713. Kepler's reach was specifically itemized. Bolade signed the authorization at 0847 Standard Time, Meridian Station, 49 hours after Petra Voss sent her 11-second message from inside a grain processing facility on a colony world that the Vorath Empire had classified as minimal strategic value. 51 hours after that, the first human strike group arrived at Vorath staging base Theta 9. Theta 9 was not a glamorous installation. The Vorath Empire, for all its centuries of colonial raiding experience, had never particularly invested in making its staging bases comfortable or impressive. They were functional fuel depots, weapons caches, repair docks, crew rotation facilities, built with the utilitarian aesthetic of an organization that views infrastructure as a means to an end, rather than something worth caring about. Commander Vorath, the garrison officer stationed at Theta 9, had complained about the base's conditions in 14 separate internal reports over the past 3 years. The heating systems cycled poorly. The cafeteria served the same protein rations on a 12-day rotation. The entertainment systems were 18 months out of date. He was composing his 15th complaint report when the proximity alarms went off. Vorath had 340 personnel at Theta 9, 2 defensive gun platforms, and a single patrol corvette docked for routine maintenance with its engines partially disassembled. He looked at his tactical display, saw what was emerging from FTL at the edge of his sensor range, and did something that, given the circumstances, was actually quite reasonable. He immediately began composing a distress signal instead. The human strike group that dropped into Theta 9's system consisted of 4 vessels, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 carrier, and a dedicated electronic warfare ship that the Vorath had never encountered before, and whose entire purpose, as Vorath's sensor officer explained with escalating distress, appeared to be making every single one of their communication systems produce nothing but static. The electronic warfare ship was named the Persistent Argument. Its captain was a wiry, sharp-eyed officer named Commander Sun Adaizi, who ran his ship with the cheerful intensity of someone who genuinely loves their job and is very good at it. His crew had a running internal competition for who could achieve full enemy communications blackout in the shortest time after dropping out of FTL. The current record was 11 seconds, held by Signals Officer Corporal Bianca Lev, who had achieved it against a pirate installation 6 months ago and had not let anyone forget it since. Theta 9's blackout took 14 seconds. Lev was disappointed. Adaizi told her the target had more redundant systems than the pirates did, which was a reasonable technical explanation, and she accepted it with the professional grace of someone who is already planning to reclaim her record at the next opportunity. Vorath's distress signal never left the system. The strike group took Theta 9 apart with methodical, unhurried precision. The defensive gun platforms were neutralized first, not destroyed. Precisely dismantled, their power cores removed with targeted strikes that left the structures standing but inert, like teeth pulled from a jaw. The patrol corvette never got its engines reassembled. The fuel depot was seized intact, which the human logistics officers were quietly very pleased about, because fuel is expensive regardless of who originally owned it. Vorath surrendered at the 2-hour mark. He was treated correctly, fed something other than the 12-day protein rotation, given access to a functioning communication channel under supervision to contact his family. He would later describe this experience to the Vorath High Directorate's Inquiry Commission with visible confusion, as if he were still not entirely sure what to make of humans who defeat you efficiently and then offer you a warm meal. While Theta 9 was being processed, 5 other strike groups were doing the same thing to 5 other staging bases simultaneously. Bolade had authorized 7 simultaneous operations. The Vorath ran 9 staging facilities total. The remaining 2 were hit within the following 18 hours, after the first 7 operations concluded and their task forces redirected. The entire staging network, the infrastructure backbone of 11 years of colonial raiding, was neutralized in less than 40 hours. 40 hours. The Vorath High Directorate received a fragmented, partial picture of this as it unfolded, because Adeze and his counterparts on the other electronic warfare ships were very good at their jobs, and the Vorath communication network between staging bases was now performing significantly below specification. High Director Koval, the senior figure of the Directorate's 7-member governing council, spent those 40 hours receiving incomplete reports, demanding complete reports, receiving more incomplete reports, and developing what his personal physician would later describe as a stress response of genuinely impressive physiological intensity. Koval was 400 years old. His species lived long. He had navigated wars, economic collapses, internal political crises, and the kind of slow institutional disasters that accumulate over centuries of governance. He had never, in 400 years, experienced anything that moved this fast. The Vorath operated on deliberate timescales. Campaigns were planned over months. Responses were debated by committee. Actions were authorized through layers of administrative review that had evolved over generations and were considered, by the Directorate's standards, a sign of civilizational maturity. The humans had gone from one raided colony to the complete destruction of the Vorath staging network in 51 hours. Koval called an emergency session of the full Directorate and said, with the measured tone of a 400-year-old who has learned not to visibly panic, "I believe we have made an error in our assessment of this species." His colleague, Director HFY, the Council's military affairs coordinator, pulled up the intelligence files, looked at them for a long moment, and said, "How long have they had consequence protocol?" The intelligence officer who answered that question visibly wished she were somewhere else. The answer was 9 years. The humans had written consequence protocol 9 years ago, updated it 3 times since then as their fleet capabilities expanded, and had been, in the clinical language of the document itself, waiting for sufficient provocation to implement it. The raid on Kepler's Reach, number 713 on Belvash's ledger, had provided that provocation. Sufficient provocation, HFY repeated slowly. Yes, Director. And what was their threshold for sufficient provocation? Another pause. It appears to have been reaching a number of raids after which they calculated a proportional response would no longer function as a deterrent. The Directorate chamber was quiet for a moment that felt, to everyone in it, considerably longer than it actually was. Koval said, "And they told no one." "No, High Director. The document is classified within their defense command. Our intelligence division had no knowledge of its existence." Koval turned slowly to look at HFY. HFY looked back. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that 11 years of treating human colonial worlds as low-resistance resource targets had been built on the foundational assumption that humans would respond to each individual incident individually, that they lacked the strategic patience to build toward a unified response, and that their political structures were too fragmented and argumentative to coordinate something at this scale. All 3 assumptions were wrong. The humans had been patient. The humans had been coordinating. And the humans' political structures, for all their legendary internal arguing, apparently achieved remarkable unanimity on the subject of what to do when someone raided 713 of their colonies. Bolad received word of the Directorate's emergency session through intelligence channels and responded by dispatching the second phase of consequence protocol, which the Directorate learned about 40 minutes later when a Terran diplomatic vessel dropped into Vorath Prime's home system, contacted orbital traffic control with precise formal credentials, requested a direct channel to the High Directorate, and delivered a message from Admiral Terence Bolad that was 11 paragraphs long, meticulously polite, and which made absolutely clear that the orbital defense network of Vorath Prime was currently within engagement range of 3 human fleet assets that had been in position for 6 hours. 6 hours. They had been there, sitting quietly, for 6 hours before announcing themselves. Director HFY read the message twice, then looked at her tactical officer, a young aide named Corvith, who had joined the Directorate's staff 4 months ago and was now experiencing a level of historical significance that his training had not fully prepared him for. "Verify the fleet positions," she said. Corvith verified them. Are they within range of our primary defense platforms? Yes, Director. And our secondary platforms, and our emergency reserve grid. HFY set the message down on the council table. They have been courteous, she said, to no one in particular. They announced themselves. They sent a diplomatic vessel. Koval said, they want us to come to a tribunal. They want the Directorate to appear before a Terran judicial body and answer for 713 raids. Yes. Another silence. Koval was 400 years old. He had made many decisions in 400 years, some of them good and some of them bad, and a handful of them that he still thought about at what passed, for his species, as 3 in the morning. He looked at the tactical display showing 3 human fleet signatures positioned around Vorath Prime, like patient, enormous punctuation marks at the end of a sentence he had not realized was being written until it was already complete. Then he looked at the message again. Bolad's final paragraph read, "The Terran Defense Command does not seek the destruction of the Vorath civilization. We seek accountability for crimes committed against our people, a binding cessation agreement, and reparations for affected colony worlds. These are achievable outcomes. We would prefer to achieve them. The alternative outcomes are also achievable. The choice, High Director, belongs entirely to you," Koval said quietly. "Get me Belvash." Belvash was located in a Vorath military rehabilitation facility, where he had been undergoing what the Vorath system diplomatically called a post-operational review, and what everyone involved understood to be a very thorough professional reckoning with the events at Kepler's Reach. He arrived before the Directorate looking older than his age, his 4 gray eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who has had 64 surviving crew members and several weeks of inquiry hearings to sit with. Koval looked at him and said, "Tell me about the woman who sent the signal." Belvash said, "She built the transmitter herself, from salvaged components, over 2 years." "Did your intelligence assessment identify her?" "No, High Director. She had no military record. She was listed as an agricultural logistics coordinator." Koval absorbed this. "An agricultural logistics coordinator," he said. "Yes. Built a military-grade tight beam transmitter in a grain facility. And we didn't know." Belvash said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. The answer was yes. The answer had always been yes. And the Intelligence Division's explanation for why they hadn't known was a document that Koval had already read 3 times and found unsatisfying each time, because the core of it, beneath all the technical language about surveillance gaps and resource allocation, came down to a simple failure of imagination. They had not imagined that a civilian agricultural logistics coordinator on a low-value colony world would spend 2 years quietly preparing for the worst, because they had not seriously considered that humans think that way. Petra Voss was not a soldier. She was not a strategist. She was a woman who had been on a world that got raided once, decided she would not be helpless a second time, and acted on that decision with the particular stubborn, private, long-term patience of a person who does not make announcements, does not wait for permission, and does not stop. The Vorath High Directorate accepted the terms of the Terran Tribunal 14 hours after receiving Bolad's message. The formal proceedings lasted 9 months. The reparations negotiation lasted 2 years after that. Koval appeared personally before the tribunal, which was an unprecedented act that drew attention across 40 star systems, and answered every question put to him, with the careful, exhausted honesty of a 400-year-old who has concluded that the time for carefully managed narratives is finished. The cessation agreement was signed on Meridian Station, in a room that Ensign Priya Thok, promoted now, Lieutenant Thok, having distinguished herself during the Consequence Protocol operation in ways that Bolade had made sure went into her permanent record, had spent 2 days helping to prepare. Bolade signed for the Terran Defense Command. Koval signed for the Vorath High Directorate. They did not shake hands, because their species have different greeting customs, and nobody wanted to make it awkward at the last moment. They did exchange a look across the signing table, the look of 2 people who are both thinking about how differently this could have gone, and how many of the things that led here were failures of paying attention. Petra Voss was not at the signing ceremony. She had declined the invitation, politely, because she had a harvest logistics report due, and the colony's new communication infrastructure was still being calibrated, and she was, as she explained to the Terran Defense Command liaison who contacted her, not really a ceremony person. She received the Terran Civilian Distinction, the highest non-military honor the Defense Command issues, in a small administrative office on Kepler's Reach, handed to her by a local official with considerably less fanfare than the occasion probably deserved. She put it on the shelf in her office, next to a technical diagram of the transmitter she had built inside the grain facility, which she had framed because it seemed like the sort of thing worth keeping. 713 raids, 1 grain facility transmitter, 11 seconds of signal. The Vorath Empire never raided another human colony, not because they were destroyed, not because they were conquered, but because somewhere in the cold math of the Directorate's strategic planning, in every threat assessment and risk model they ran for the next 100 years, there was a variable they could never fully account for. The next Petra Voss. Already building something. Already waiting. Already ready. In a grain facility somewhere that nobody had thought to check.